In the winter of 1891, a marriage paper was filed in Wilcox County, Alabama. It showed the marriage of two 16-year-olds who had the same last name and were born on the same day. The county clerk didn't notice anything strange, but hidden in a box of letters found 70 years later, a woman's confession would show what that paper really meant. The census records kept in the Alabama Department of Archives show a simple picture. In 1875, the Peton family in Wilcox County had 4 people. Samuel Peton, age 32, cotton farmer, his wife Margaret, age 29, and their newborn twins Alice and Andrew, born on March 14th of that year. Wilcox County in the 1870s was a place of money problems. The Civil War had destroyed the plantation system, and Reconstruction brought chaos instead of recovery. Small farms like the Petons struggled on worn-out soil miles from any town, connected to the wider world only by bumpy roads that became impossible to use in winter. The twins grew up in this isolation. Later documents show they rarely met other children. The one-room schoolhouse that served their area closed in 1883 because of lack of money. Church attendance, according to records from Pine Grove Baptist, happened rarely. The Peton family appeared on the church list 3 times between 1875 and 1889, always noted as visiting from a distant farm. Samuel Peton died in October of 1889. The death certificate filed weeks late said his death was from lung fever, probably pneumonia. Margaret followed him 9 months later in July of 1890. Her death record noted wasting sickness, a general term that could have meant anything from tuberculosis to cancer. Both are buried in unmarked graves in the Pine Grove Cemetery. Their locations are now lost to overgrown plants and time. This left Alice and Andrew alone on the failing farm at age 15. No other family members appear in any records. The uncle listed as guardian on their marriage certificate the following year, one Robert Peton of Mobile, had actually left Alabama in 1886, according to city directories found by researchers years later. His signature on the certificate was almost certainly faked. The marriage was filed on November 7, 1891. Both listed their age as 16. The ceremony was supposedly performed by a justice of the peace whose name appears nowhere else in county records. No witnesses signed. The document sat in the Wilcox County Courthouse for 70 years before anyone questioned what it actually meant. The practice had a name among those who knew of it, though it was never spoken out loud in public places. Keeping the blood close, they called it. And in the isolated parts of rural Alabama, where farms failed and families faced starvation, it became a desperate solution to an impossible problem. Mrs. Catherine Whitfield, who would later investigate these cases, kept letters that explained the logic. When a farmer died, leaving only young children, dividing property between them meant pieces too small to survive on. If those children married outsiders, the land would scatter further, absorbed into other families. But if siblings married each other, the farm stayed whole. The workers remained together. The family name continued on the property their parents had died working. It was money calculation pretending to be tradition, and it grew in places where the outside world had stopped looking. The Alabama Historical Society archives contain letters from 3 rural parishes in the Black Belt counties, places where cotton had destroyed the soil and poverty had destroyed hope. Reverend Thomas Gaines of Pine Grove Baptist wrote to the state church office in 1892. His letter was marked confidential and distressing. He described being approached by families asking for his blessing for marriages he could not in good conscience perform. They speak of it as though it were as ordinary as any union, he wrote, as though God's law and nature's law might be suspended by their need. Gaines never performed such ceremonies, but others did. Justice of the Peace records from Wilcox, Marengo, and Monroe counties show a pattern of marriages between people sharing last names and similar birth dates, always with suspicious documentation. Guardian signatures that matched neither previous nor later examples of those guardians' handwriting. Wedding dates listed, but no witnesses named. Couples who appeared in census records as siblings 5 years before, now listed as married pairs. Church records reveal the size. Pine Grove Baptist documented 2 sibling marriages between 1870 and 1895. Shiloh Methodist recorded 3. Mount Zion Presbyterian noted 2 more. All involved families whose land had shrunk below survivable size, whose father or mother had recently died, whose children faced a choice between this arrangement or complete poverty. The communities knew, they had to have known. Yet the silence around these unions was complete. No gossip appears in surviving letters from the time. No scandals erupted in the local newspapers, though those papers eagerly reported every other form of wrongdoing. The practice existed in a space too shameful to acknowledge, too desperate for anyone to step in. Alice's marriage certificate sits among these others in the archives, different only because of what came after. Most sibling marriages left no record beyond the initial paperwork. Couples either died young or disappeared from census records entirely, moving away, or perhaps simply being erased by relatives who wanted no reminder. But Alice wrote everything down. Her diary, bound in cracked leather and tied with a faded ribbon, contains entries beginning 3 months after the wedding. The first page is dated February 9, 1892. The handwriting is careful, more educated than one might expect from a farm girl who barely attended school. Her mother had taught her, Alice explained in an early entry, using the family Bible and a few precious books as texts. I must write this. The first entry begins, because if I do not, no one will ever know what truly happened here. No one will understand that we did not choose this freely, that we were given no other path. Andrew says I should burn these pages, that putting words to our situation makes it more real. But it is already real. It has been real since the day the county clerk looked at our papers and asked no questions. The tradition had trapped her, and she would spend the next 3 years trying to survive it. Alice discovered she was pregnant in late May of 1892. The diary entry from May 23rd contains no long description, just 7 words written so hard that the pen tore through the paper. I felt the sickness this morning. God help me. What followed were weeks of growing terror documented in pages that become harder and harder to read, not from faded ink, but from the raw panic bleeding through every sentence. Alice knew what pregnancy between siblings could produce. She had seen it once before years earlier, though she never wrote the family's name. A neighboring farm 3 miles distant, where a child was born who could not speak or walk properly, whose features seemed wrong in ways Alice's young mind could not describe. That family had disappeared within a year, and no one ever mentioned them again. Andrew will not speak of it, she wrote on June 2nd. When I told him, he turned his back and walked to the fields. He did not return until dark. We ate in silence. I tried to tell him we must seek help, that I need to see someone who understands these matters. But he only said the same thing he always says no one can know. The nearest doctor practiced in Camden, 20 miles away. But reaching Camden required Andrew's cooperation, required him to hitch the wagon, to make the journey with her, to sit in a waiting room where questions would be asked. Dr. Harrison Webb's practice books kept by his grandson show no entry for any patent between 1890 and 1895. Alice never made it to his office. She tried once. The diary entry from July 9th describes her attempt in detail that still carries the sting of desperation. She woke before dawn, dressed in her mother's old traveling clothes, and began walking east toward the main road. She made it 4 miles before Andrew caught up with her on horseback. He did not shout, Alice wrote. That would have been easier to bear. Instead, he simply rode beside me in silence until I stopped walking. Then he said, "You know what will happen if people learn the truth? They will take the farm. They will put us in separate institutions. They will say we are insane or criminal or worse." I told him I did not care, that I would rather face any of those outcomes than bring a child into this situation without proper care. He said, "You care about the child. I care about us surviving. We cannot have both." She turned back. The walk home took 3 hours in the rising heat, Andrew trailing behind her the entire way. By August, her condition was becoming obvious. Alice wrote of making loose dresses from old curtains, of avoiding the rare passers-by who sometimes used the road near their property. A peddler came by in mid-August, the first visitor in months. Alice hid in the house while Andrew purchased supplies. She watched through the gap in the floorboards as the peddler asked about the farm, about the family, about why everything looked so neglected. Andrew told him I was ill, she recorded, said I had been sick since spring and could not do the household work anymore. The peddler offered to fetch a doctor from town. Andrew refused, said we had no money for such things. The peddler looked at our property, at the dying crops, at the house that needs repair, and I saw pity in his face. He left us a small bag of cornmeal without asking for payment. Andrew threw it in the pig trough after he left, said we did not need anyone's charity. September brought the first physical changes Alice could not hide even from herself. The movements inside her, the certainty that in a few months she would give birth in that isolated farmhouse with no help, no knowledge, and no hope that anything could end well. The labor began on March 11, 1893, 3 days before the twins' 18th birthday. Alice's diary entries from the weeks before show she had been preparing as best she could, gathering clean cloth, boiling water in advance, reading and rereading the single medical book her mother had owned, a home physician's guide published in 1867, its pages brittle and spotted with mildew. The book contained a chapter on childbirth, 14 pages of clinical descriptions and warnings about problems, written for an audience of rural families who might go weeks without seeing a doctor. Alice had memorized every word. None of it prepared her for what actually happened. The pain started before dawn. She wrote later, her handwriting shaky but deliberate. I woke Andrew and told him. He asked what he should do. I had no answer. What could either of us do? He said he needed to check the fences in the north field, that the cow had been getting loose. I told him not to leave. He left anyway. For the next 8 hours, Alice labored alone in the house. The diary describes pain that came in waves, each one stronger than the last. Her body doing something it was designed to do, but under circumstances nature never intended. She walked from room to room when she could still walk. She gripped the bedpost when standing became impossible. She called out for her mother, for anyone, knowing no one would hear. Andrew returned at midday. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom, his face pale, his hands useless at his sides. Alice begged him to ride for help, to fetch someone from Camden, to bring back a midwife, a doctor, anyone with knowledge. He shook his head. It's too late now, he said. The child will come before I could return. He was right. By early evening, as the March light faded outside the windows, Alice delivered a daughter. The entry describing this moment is the shortest in the entire diary. She came at dusk. I knew immediately something was wrong. Medical professionals who examined Alice's descriptions nearly 70 years later could only guess about the specific conditions present. The infant's skull was misshapen, Alice wrote, not from the birth process, but as though it had formed incorrectly from the beginning. One eye sat higher than the other. Her arms seemed too short for her body. When Alice tried to help her nurse, the baby could not properly latch, could not seem to coordinate the movements necessary for feeding. Andrew looked at his daughter once, then walked out of the house. He He did not return until morning. Alice sat through the night holding the infant, trying everything she knew to help her feed. She dipped cloth in water and let drops fall into the baby's mouth. She held her, rocked her, whispered to her. The child made small sounds, whimpering cries that grew weaker as the hours passed. I named her Margaret for my mother, Alice wrote. I do not know if Andrew ever knew her name, he never asked. The baby died on the morning of March 14th, the twins' birthday. She had lived 3 days. Alice wrapped her in the cleanest cloth she could find and buried her beneath the oak tree behind the house, the same tree where her parents used to sit on summer evenings. She marked the spot with a stone. Andrew was in the fields. He never helped dig the grave. No birth certificate was filed with the county. No death record exists in any archive. Margaret Peaton lived and died with no official proof that she had ever existed at all. One more secret buried in Wilcox County soil. After Margaret's death, the diary entries change. Where before Alice wrote daily, sometimes multiple times in a single day, now weeks pass between entries. The handwriting becomes less controlled. Sentences trail off unfinished. Entire pages contain nothing but dates, as though Alice opened the book intending to write but could find no words good enough for what she was living through. The first entry after the burial comes on April 2nd, 1893. Andrew sleeps in the barn now. We have not spoken in 19 days. The crops need planting, but he does nothing. I tried to work the field myself yesterday. Made it 3 rows before my body gave out. Everything still hurts from the birth. I think something inside me tore that never healed properly. The farm was collapsing around them. Without both of them working from dawn to dusk, the property could not sustain itself. The vegetable garden Alice had maintained went to weeds. Fences fell into disrepair. The pig died in May, and neither of them had the will to deal with the carcass for 2 days. Their own survival became a daily question mark. In June, Andrew began disappearing. The first time he left before dawn and did not return until the following afternoon. He smelled of corn whiskey and something else, something sharp Alice could not identify. He went to the barn without speaking and slept for 14 hours. I know where he goes. Alice wrote on June 23rd. There are illegal stills in the hills northwest of here, places where men go to forget whatever they need to forget. He takes the last of our money. He takes tools to trade. Yesterday, he took Mother's silver hairbrush, the only thing of value left in this house. When he came back, he could barely stand. The isolation that had always defined their existence became something darker. Before, they had been alone together. Now Alice was alone with someone who had become a stranger, whose grief and shame had turned into something she no longer recognized. Local residents began to avoid their property entirely. A note in the Pine Grove Baptist records from July of 1893 mentions the Peaton place in the context of a discussion about church outreach. Decided against visit, the secretary wrote. Brother Gaines reports an unwholesome atmosphere about the property. Several members expressed reluctance. What had people seen or heard? The diary offers clues. In August, Alice recorded a peddler approaching the house, then turning his wagon around before reaching the gate. In September, a family traveling to Camden passed on the road. Their children pointed at the house. The parents urged their horse faster. We have become a ghost story, Alice wrote. People cross themselves when they mention us, if they mention us at all. Yesterday, I walked to the main road and a woman coming the other direction saw me and actually ran for me as though I carried plague. Perhaps I do. Perhaps whatever poison lives in this place shows on my face. By October, Andrew's absences stretched to 3 and 4 days at a time. Alice stopped noting them in the diary. She wrote instead about the silence, about sitting in the house where she was born and feeling like she had already died, about looking at the oak tree where Margaret lay buried and wondering why she continued breathing when her daughter could not. Andrew said once that we had to do this to survive, she wrote on November 3rd. But what we have now is not survival. It is not even existence. We are 2 people waiting in separate corners of hell for something to end this. Reverend Hosier Blackburn arrived at the Peaton farm on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1895. He was a circuit preacher traveling between isolated communities that could not support their own clergy, and he had never visited this particular property before. His personal journal donated to the Alabama Baptist Historical Society by his family in 1932 describes what he found. The house appeared abandoned from the road, he wrote. The gate hung from one hinge. Weeds had overtaken what was once a path. I nearly turned back, thinking the family had moved on, but then I saw smoke from the chimney. Someone was alive in there. Alice heard his knock and did not answer. She had learned that strangers meant complications, questions she could not answer safely. But Blackburn persisted. He called out that he was a man of God, that he meant no harm, that he simply wished to offer prayer and fellowship to anyone who might need it. I opened the door because his voice sounded kind. Alice wrote later. I had not heard kindness in so long that I had forgotten what it sounded like. A Blackburn's journal describes a young woman who appeared far older than her 20 years, her face thin, her dress hanging loose on a frame that had once been healthier. The house behind her was dim and bare. Furniture pushed against walls, the air stale. When he asked after her family, she told him there was no one else. Her husband, she said, left days ago and she did not know when he would return. Something in her voice alarmed him. He asked if he might sit with her a while, if she would accept his company for the afternoon. Alice hesitated, then agreed. They sat at the kitchen table and Blackburn spoke of ordinary things at first, the weather, the roads, the communities he had visited. Slowly, carefully, he created a space where conversation felt possible. She did not tell me everything that first day, Blackburn recorded, but she told me enough. Enough to understand that this young woman was trapped in circumstances that defied both God's law and natural order. Enough to know that I could not simply pray with her and ride away. He returned the next day. Andrew had still not come back. This time, Blackburn brought food from the last household where he had stayed: fresh bread, dried meat, preserves. Alice accepted them with tears in her eyes. He asked her directly, did she want to leave this place? The question hung in the air between them. Alice's diary entry from that evening shows how carefully she weighed her answer. If I say yes, where would I go? If I leave, what becomes of Andrew? If people learn why I must leave, what happens to both of us? But if I stay, I know with certainty that I will die here. Perhaps not today or tomorrow, but soon. This place is killing me as surely as it killed my daughter. She told him yes. Blackburn had a sister in Montgomery, a widow named Mrs. Dorothy Blackburn, who took in women needing work and shelter. He proposed bringing Alice there, helping her find employment, giving her a chance to build a different life. He would arrange everything quietly. No authorities needed to be involved. No public scandal required. On April 28th, while Andrew remained wherever he went during his absences, Alice gathered her few belongings into a canvas bag: the diary, her mother's Bible, 2 dresses. She walked out of the farmhouse where she had been born, where her parents had died, where her daughter lay buried beneath the oak tree. She did not look back. Blackburn's journal notes that she cried the entire ride to Montgomery. But when he asked if she wanted to return, she only shook her head and said, "Take me as far from here as you can." Dorothy Blackburn's home on Perry Street in Montgomery housed 6 women when Alice arrived in May of 1895. All were what polite society called unfortunate circumstances. Women fleeing bad marriages, abusive families, or simple poverty. Dorothy asked few questions. She provided meals, shared rooms, and connections to respectable employment. In exchange, the women contributed what they could to household expenses once they found work. Alice spent her first week in near silence. She helped with cooking and cleaning but spoke to no one beyond necessary courtesies. The other women respected her privacy, recognizing in her the particular kind of trauma that needed time before it could be voiced. Dorothy found her work at a dressmaker shop on Dexter Avenue. The owner, Mrs. Helena Vance, needed someone skilled with a needle who could work quickly and precisely. Alice's mother had taught her well. Within 2 weeks, Mrs. Vance was giving her the more complex alterations, the delicate repairs that required steady hands and patience. It was at the dressmaker shop that Alice met Mrs. Catherine Whitfield. Whitfield was 43 years old in 1895, a former schoolteacher whose husband had died in a railway accident, leaving her with a modest inheritance and no children. She had devoted herself to what she called practical charity, work that addressed actual needs rather than theoretical virtue. She served on the board of the Montgomery Women's Aid Society, an organization that provided legal assistance and shelter to women navigating difficult circumstances. She came to Mrs. Vance's shop in June to have several dresses altered. Alice took her measurements and mentioned, as was customary, that the final fitting would be ready in a week. Whitfield noticed something in Alice's manner, a careful precision, a way of keeping her eyes down, a voice that suggested education beyond what one might expect. "You are not from Montgomery," Whitfield observed. It was not a question. "No, ma'am." "Wilcox County? What brought you here?" Alice's hand stilled on the fabric she was pinning. For a long moment she did not answer. Then, quietly, "I needed to leave." Whitfield recognized that tone. She had heard it before from women carrying secrets that felt too dangerous to speak aloud. She did something unusual. She asked Alice if she might visit Dorothy Blackburn's home that evening, if they might speak privately about matters that sometimes needed careful discussion. The meeting minutes from the Women's Aid Society preserved in the Alabama Department of Archives and History contain an entry dated June 18, 1895. Under new cases for consideration, a brief note appears: young woman age 20 fled marriage of extraordinary circumstances. Details documented separately given sensitive nature. Those details exist in Whitfield's private papers. Alice told her everything. The forced marriage to her twin brother, the pregnancy, Margaret's birth and death, the 2 years of silent horror on that failing farm. She spoke for nearly 3 hours while Whitfield took notes in careful shorthand, her face growing increasingly grave. When Alice finished, Whitfield sat in silence before asking a single question: "Do you believe yours was the only such arrangement?" Alice had never considered it. In her mind, her situation had been uniquely terrible, an aberration born of desperate circumstance. But Whitfield had spent years working with rural women. She had heard fragments of similar stories, pieces that had never quite formed a complete picture until now. "I need to investigate this," Whitfield said. "With your permission, I would like to look into whether other families in isolated counties have engaged in this practice. If they have, those women deserve the same chance at freedom that Reverend Blackburn gave you." Alice agreed. Neither woman could have anticipated what that investigation would uncover, or how violently certain people would resist the truth being exposed. Catherine Whitfield began her investigation in July of 1895 by requesting marriage records from 5 rural counties: Wilcox, Marengo, Monroe, Clark, and Choctaw. County clerks were required by law to provide copies of public records upon written request. 3 counties complied within weeks. 2 never responded at all. The records revealed patterns immediately. Between 1870 and 1895, Whitfield identified 14 marriages where both parties shared identical last names and birth years within the same county. She cross-referenced these with census data and found that in 11 cases, the couples had been listed as siblings in previous counts. The remaining 3 had no prior census records, suggesting they might have been deliberately left out or that families had moved to avoid documentation. Her letters with other women's aid societies across Alabama uncovered more cases. A woman in Marengo County wrote of a sister who had married her brother and died in childbirth at age 17. Another letter from Monroe County described a family where 2 siblings lived as husband and wife until both died in a house fire, leaving behind a child with severe disabilities who died in an institution within a year. In September, Whitfield traveled to Wilcox County herself. She visited the courthouse and requested to examine not just marriage certificates but property records, death certificates, and tax assessments. The clerk, a man named Porter Weeks, grew suspicious of her questions. "What exactly is your interest in these families?" he asked. "I am documenting cases of legal irregularity for a women's charitable organization," Whitfield replied carefully. "These are legal marriages properly filed and witnessed. The witnesses' names appear on no other documents in your records. Several of the guardians who supposedly provided consent were not resident in Alabama at the time." Weekie's expression hardened. "You are making serious accusations, ma'am. I suggest you direct any concerns to appropriate authorities." She did exactly that. In October, Whitfield wrote to the Alabama Attorney General's office detailing her findings and requesting an investigation into fraudulent marriage documentation and potential criminal conduct in isolated rural communities. The response came 6 weeks later, a brief letter stating that without specific complaints from alleged victims, the state had no grounds to pursue the matter. Whitfield tried the county sheriff in Wilcox. Sheriff James Harcourt received her at his office in Camden and listened to her evidence with visible discomfort. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and spoke with the careful tone of someone choosing words to avoid future problems. "Mrs. Whitfield, I understand your concerns, but you are asking me to investigate families who have not complained of any wrongdoing, to interfere in marriages that were legally documented, and to expose matters that would destroy what little stability these communities have left. These are people barely surviving. If I ride out to these farms and start asking questions about their private arrangements, what do you imagine happens next?" "Justice," Whitfield said. "Scandal," Harcourt corrected. "Families torn apart, children placed in institutions, property seized. And for what? To satisfy the moral sensibilities of people in Montgomery who have never spent a winter wondering if they will starve before spring." He stood, signaling the conversation was over. "I will not pursue this. I advise you to let it rest as well." But Whitfield could not let it rest. Through November and December, she continued gathering evidence and writing letters. She contacted church organizations, medical professionals, legal experts. Most ignored her inquiries. A few responded with carefully worded suggestions that she focus her charitable efforts elsewhere. Then in January of 1896, she received an unsigned letter. It contained no return address, no date, just 4 sentences written in block capitals. Family especial I do ambiguousness. If you coated it, I vista ige on you obuel ruggedity. To I says you onig. Whitfield showed the letter to Alice, who recognized it for what it was. Someone with power, someone invested in maintaining some, had decided she had gone too far. Catherine Whitfield received 2 more threatening letters in February of 1896. The second one mentioned her home address, the street where she walked to church, and the name of the dressmaker shop where Alice worked. The message was unmistakable. Whoever was sending these knew where to find them both. In March, Whitfield made the difficult decision to cease her investigation. She wrote to Alice explaining her reasoning in a letter preserved among her papers. "I cannot in good conscience continue this work if it places you in danger. You have already survived more than any person should have to endure. I will not be the instrument of further harm coming to you." Alice's response, written the same day, was brief. "I understand, you tried. That is more than anyone else did." Whitfield compiled all her findings into a single-bound report, nearly 80 pages of documentation, witness statements, and analysis. She deposited it with the Alabama Historical Society in April of 1896 with instructions that it remain sealed for 25 years. Perhaps, she wrote in her cover letter, future generations will have the courage to address what we could not. The practice itself continued in the most isolated pockets of rural Alabama, though increasingly rare as better roads and improved communication reduced the extreme isolation that had enabled it. The last documented case Whitfield had identified dated to 1895, the year Alice escaped. Whether others occurred after is impossible to know. Such arrangements by their nature left little evidence when families chose to maintain complete silence. Andrew Peyton's story ended in the winter of 1903. The death certificate filed by the Monroe County coroner listed the cause as exposure and acute alcohol intoxication. A farmer found his body in a drainage ditch 3 miles from the old Peyton property on January 12th. He had been dead for at least 2 days. The coroner estimated his age as 30, though he was actually 27. Hard living had aged him beyond his years. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the county poor field, a section of the Pine Grove Cemetery reserved for the poor and unknowns. No service was held. No obituary appeared in any newspaper. The farm he had tried so desperately to keep had been sold for unpaid taxes in 1898, absorbed into a larger plantation whose owners never knew the property's history. Alice learned of his death 3 months later when a letter arrived from a clerk in Wilcox County. There were no assets, no estate to settle, just a notification that her legal husband had died and the marriage was dissolved. She read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the bottom of her trunk beneath the diary she had not opened in years. By 1903, Alice had built a different life. She had married Samuel Corrigan in December of 1898, a widower 12 years her senior who managed a feed store in Montgomery. He was a quiet man, kind in his reserve, who asked few questions about her past. She told him she had been married before, that her first husband had been troubled, that the marriage had been brief and unhappy. He accepted this without demanding details. They had 4 children between 1899 and 1906, 3 daughters and a son, all healthy, all growing up in a house filled with books and conversation and ordinary domestic rhythms. Alice never told them about their half-sister buried under an oak tree in Wilcox County. She never mentioned that their Uncle Andrew had also been their father's predecessor. Some truths, she had decided, served no purpose except to inflict inherited pain. She lived until 1958, dying at age 83, surrounded by grandchildren who knew her as a gentle woman who loved gardens and always insisted on proper documentation of every family event, birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds. "Write it down," she would say. Everything important should be written down. None of them understood why she felt so strongly about such things until after her death, when they found the diary. Alice's granddaughter, Susan Corrigan Hayes, found the diary in August of 1958 while sorting through her grandmother's belongings. It was wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of an old steamer trunk beneath layers of carefully preserved clothing and documents. The leather binding had cracked with age, but the pages remained intact, the ink still readable after more than 60 years. Susan read it in a single sitting, alone in her grandmother's empty house. And when she finished, she sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour. The woman she had known, the gentle grandmother who baked pies and tended roses and never raised her voice, had survived something Susan could barely comprehend. She immediately contacted the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Dr. Raymond Fisher, a historian specializing in post-Civil War rural Alabama, was assigned to authenticate the diary and investigate its claims. His initial report, filed in September of 1958, expressed skepticism. The content seemed too disturbing, too extraordinary. Surely such practices could not have occurred in documented, legally recognized marriages. But as Fisher dug deeper, the evidence mounted. He found Alice's marriage certificate from 1891 exactly as she had described it. He located census records showing Alice and Andrew Peyton as twins born in 1875. He discovered Catherine Whitfield's sealed report at the Historical Society, and with permission from the board, opened it 27 years ahead of schedule. Whitfield's documentation corroborated everything. Fisher spent the next 2 years traveling across southern Alabama, examining courthouse records, interviewing elderly residents who remembered families from that era, and piecing together a historical pattern that had been deliberately obscured. His findings, published in 1961 in the Journal of Southern History, sent shockwaves through academic circles. The article, titled "Isolation and Desperation: Sibling Marriage in Post-Reconstruction Alabama," documented at least 12 confirmed cases between 1870 and 1900, with evidence suggesting as many as 20 additional probable cases where records had been destroyed or never properly filed. Fisher's research revealed the specific conditions that had enabled the practice. The collapse of the plantation economy after the Civil War created pockets of extreme rural poverty. Farms that had once been marginally viable became death traps for families without resources. When parents died young, as they frequently did from disease, overwork, and inadequate medical care, children faced impossible choices: divide the property and watch each parcel become too small to sustain life, sell and have nothing, or marry each other, keep the land intact and hope no one asked too many questions. Local governments, understaffed and underfunded, had neither the resources nor the will to investigate suspicious marriages in remote areas. County clerks processed paperwork mechanically. Justices of the peace, many barely literate themselves, accepted whatever documents appeared before them. Churches, already struggling to serve scattered congregations, chose not to see what would require impossible moral confrontations. The result was a conspiracy of silence that protected no one and harmed everyone it touched. Fisher attempted to track the outcomes of the marriages Whitfield had documented. Of the 12 confirmed cases, he could locate death records for 19 individuals. Average age at death 31. 6 had produced children. Of those children, only 3 survived past age 5. The others died of conditions Fisher's medical consultants identified as consistent with genetic disorders arising from consanguineous relationships. The broader impact on communities was equally devastating. Families who engaged in these arrangements became socially isolated, avoided even by their neighbors. The properties themselves gained reputations that persisted for generations. Several farms Fisher identified were still locally known by names like the Cursed Place or That Bad House, decades after the original families had disappeared. Most disturbing was Fisher's discovery that officials had known. Sheriff Harcourt's private papers, donated to the Monroe County Historical Society after his death, contained a letter from 1897 in which he acknowledged knowing of at least 4 sibling marriages in his jurisdiction. "I have chosen not to intervene," he wrote to a colleague. as the alternative would be to destroy these families entirely and place burdens on an already strained county relief system. The choice to preserve economic stability over human dignity had been made consciously, repeatedly, by people in positions of authority. When Fisher's article was published, several families contacted him with their own stories. A woman in her 70s wrote that her mother had been the product of a sibling marriage and had spent her entire life carrying the shame of it. A man from Marengo County sent copies of letters his grandmother had written describing her sister's forced marriage to their brother. These accounts had been preserved in family archives but never shared publicly until Fisher's research made it possible to speak about them. Alice's diary became the centerpiece of a permanent exhibit at the Alabama Department of Archives and History in 1963. It sits now in a climate-controlled case open to the entry from March 14, 1893, the day Margaret was born and died. Visitors read Alice's words and struggled to reconcile the measured, educated handwriting with the horror of what it describes. The exhibit includes Catherine Whitfield's report, the threatening letters she received, and documentation of how systematically the truth had been suppressed. It serves as a reminder of what happens when poverty becomes so extreme that basic human bonds dissolve, when isolation allows practices that would be unthinkable in more connected communities, when authorities choose willful blindness over difficult intervention. Alice's 4 children with Samuel Corrigan all lived into their 80s. They had a combined total of 13 children, 37 grandchildren, and over 90 great-grandchildren. None of them knew about Margaret, about Andrew, about the farm in Wilcox County until the diary's discovery forced those conversations. Susan Hayes, who found the diary, wrote in her own memoir published in 1985 that learning her grandmother's truth changed how she understood resilience. She survived something that should have destroyed her, Susan wrote, and then she built a life so completely normal, so thoroughly ordinary that we never suspected the weight she carried. That is not weakness. That is strength beyond measure. The oak tree where Margaret Peaton was buried stood until 1973 when a storm finally toppled it. By then, the property had changed hands 5 times, and no one remembered what lay beneath its roots. If you've stayed with us through Alice's story, through the darkness of what she endured and the courage it took to survive, click the like button and subscribe. I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it? These stories matter. They matter because Alice matters, because Margaret matters, because the truth, no matter how painful, deserves to be known. These voices from the past are calling to us, asking us to remember, asking us to never let silence protect injustice again. Thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing witness.